Hi, welcome to our channel of IGNOU Audiobooks, Indira Gandhi National Open University, School of Gender and Development Studies, SOGS, Certificate Program, Certificate in Gender in Law, CGSL, BGS 011 Understanding Gender and Law, Block 1 Understanding Gender, Unit 3 Mapping Sexualities, 3.1 Introduction. By now you know about basic understanding of the concept of sex, gender, and sexuality. In this unit, you will learn how a historical and cultural aspect related to sexualities operates. Generally, the term sexuality elicits responses that have to do with biology, that is, whether as an area of study or as a set of ideas people have about their intimate lives, is sexuality too easily detached from the social contexts where it belongs and presented as something of itself. There is a strong tendency to view one's sexual life as dictated by its own peculiar rules that a. are biologically derived, b. have been historically stable, i.e., the same since the dawn of time, c. are essentially about our private lives, and d. are basically the same across different cultures. This unit is intended to outline that sexuality cannot be understood on its own terms. It seeks to emphasize that we cannot meaningfully begin to deploy it for whatever purposes we have in mind, activism, scholarship, etc., until we can comprehend fully that it is nothing but an empty vessel, filling up with a diversity of meanings, beliefs, and actions depending on historical, social, and cultural contexts. Hence, we can only productively engage with this topic through understanding the different contexts which influence the making of sexuality, or, more accurately, sexualities, rather than insisting that it constitutes a world unto itself. We tend to both inflate its significance and downplay its role as a social process by treating it as a private thing. So, for example, if you are a bad cook, it's a minor blemish, but being bad at sex may be seen in some cultures as a major crisis which requires intervention through seeking help of sexologists. For example, 3.2 Learning Outcomes. After reading this unit, you will be able to times define what is sexuality, times discuss and analyze sexuality across time period, culture and society, with reference to class, status and politics, times locate sexuality in its historical existence and change, and times analyze sexuality in relation to identity and the notion of power. 3.3 Sexuality in society. It is ironic that Sigmund Freud, 1856 to 1939, whose writings were fundamental to providing new, non-biological directions in the study of sexuality in the West, firmly believed that sexuality was subject to biological drives. Despite literary, historical, artistic, and other evidence that suggests that sexuality, both its expression and control, is fundamentally linked to contexts such as class, religion, wealth, and gender norms, we nevertheless tend to delink it from these social realities. If anything, we are inclined to think of these aspects as incidental, choosing to believe that, underneath it all, there lurks a fundamentally fixed essence and a drive we can identify as sexuality. So, the kinds of questions this unit seeks to explore are: can we regard sexuality as a fixed concept that can be easily understood both across different time periods and different cultures? Or is it a made up of the most diverse contexts of social and cultural life, registering changes as this change? European theorists of the topic, such as Michel Foucault, 1990, have suggested that sexuality as a clearly demarcated field of study and debate emerges during the early 18th century through a combination of medical, legal, educational, and other discourses. That is to say, certain ideas regarding sexuality that did not earlier exist emerged during this period, and that the emergence of these ideas was linked to the ways in which sexual behavior was sought to be understood and controlled by a variety of experts such as doctors, judges, and teachers. This, in turn, led to the emergence of different categories of sexual beings such as the homosexual, the heterosexual, the sexualized woman, the sexually awakened child, the reproductive family, the pervert, etc. Soon after, Foucault suggests sexuality became focused on the family. That is to say, an entire range of experts, doctors, psychiatrists, priests, teachers, etc., concentrated their attention on the family, advising against the perils of bad sexuality and ensuring its good health. So, through these processes, the family was both sexualized and acted as an agent of sexualization. That is, it became the benchmark for topics such as good and bad sexuality and healthy sexual behavior. In this way, Foucault suggests sexuality became a very important topic of discussion rather than being banned from being discussed or repressed, as is commonly thought. Good sexuality within the family, reproductive sexuality, able to produce a suitable labor force, then became part of the development of capitalism. As we will see in the sections that follow, there are several additional contexts to be considered when we think of sexuality in the non-Western context. However, the key point to retain is the social and historical nature of sexuality. There is one final point to consider that also relates to the way in which the topic of sexuality is researched. From a social science perspective, sexuality remains an area of study perhaps even more than other kinds of social behavior where any degree of methodological precision is impossible to posit. This perspective differs from that shared by medically trained sexologists and others who offer a scientific point of view. This follows from the perspective that we must rethink the truth of our sexuality perspective as well as the biologism that has historically afflicted sexuality studies. The former suggests that A. Sexual behavior ought to be judged according to certain norms, and B. There is an underlying truth about our sexual lives that we must understand. For example, the gay gene explains homosexuality, sexual orientation is a fixed trait, men have uncontrollable sexual drives, etc. Biologism in the study of sexuality, as already indicated above, is connected to the view that sexuality, can be explained by recourse to a set of unchanging bodily essences and drives. Hence, just as we tend to think that our genders are biologically determined, so too we assume that our sexual lives unfold according to an inner biological template. This, in turn, connects to two other ideas. Firstly, we think in terms of expressing our sexuality as if it is an essence that simply appears through its own natural logic. Another point of view would be to say that we enact our sexual selves, that is, it is learnt behavior. And, secondly, we too easily assume that, underneath are visible differences such as class and status. We harbor the same sexual drive. Thinking about sexuality in another context, one that is just as susceptible to the inner drive discussion, Jeffrey Weeks, 2003, points out that the real problem does not lie in whether homosexuality is inborn or learned. It lies, instead, in the question, what are the meanings this particular culture gives to homosexual behavior, however it may be caused, and what are the effects of those meanings on the ways in which individuals organize their sexual lives. Weeks, 2003, p. 34. This is an excellent way of thinking about the broader field of sexualities itself, moving beyond medicalized approaches to sexuality and those that derive from the quantitative sciences. We can identify certain other frameworks that have sought to capture the social and cultural complexities within which sexual cultures are located. The Marxist approach, for example, suggests that we primarily view sexuality as a series of economic relations of domination and exploitation. So, Marxists would argue the heterosexual family is a key site of support for capitalist relations of production inasmuch as it facilitates the seamless reproduction of a labor force that is socialized into an unquestioning acceptance of social and economic inequalities. The overwhelming emphasis on the economic within Marxist approaches does not, however, do justice to the various other matrices of sexual cultures. How to account for non-heterosexual cultures, for example? The psychoanalytic approach to sexuality derives from the pioneering writings of Sigmund Freud on the topic. This approach emphasizes the role of multiple levels of consciousness in the making of sexual selves. Hence, the psychoanalytic approach would suggest that the sexual behavior and thought is mere surface activity that masks deeper fears, anxieties, and desires. Notwithstanding its interest in exploring the influence of the social environment in the making of human sexuality, Freudian psychoanalysis nevertheless proceeds from the assumption that sexuality, derives from deeply embedded biological drives. The drive model is increasingly being replaced by relational and object relations perspectives. These may retain some of the essentialism of drive theory but have also drawn upon the writings of Foucault, feminism, and postmodernism to seriously rethink their earlier models. Feminist frameworks of analysis posit the historical subordination of women as the fundamental grounds for analysis. The feminist approach cuts across all other analytical contexts, providing important ways of understanding the role of gendered power in the making of human relations. Another approach is referred to as the social constructivist approach. Here, sexuality is explored through focusing upon its constructed nature. That is, the different forms it takes according to the different social and historical circumstances. This approach moves away from notions of fixity and inner drives towards ideas regarding constant flux in human behavior and identity. The approach has been criticized for downplaying the role of biology. What is important to remember is that biology always operates in tandem with social and cultural realities, and it is this combination that produces different ways of being. This way of positing the issues avoids constituting biology and culture as totally unrelated realms or biology as prior to culture. It also serves to emphasize the fact that we become human only in human society. Padgug, 1989. Precisely because sexuality is a learnt behavior, it differs across different times and different cultures. Hence, there is no universal category of the sexual that holds true across all times and across all cultures. What is erotic in one culture might not be regarded as such in another. This way of thinking about the topic also avoids thinking in terms of norms, that one particular context of sexual preference, behavior, and desire is better than another. Finally, within context, while it is important to avoid biological reductionism, we should also avoid the trap of absolute difference. So, approaches that seek to posit an absolute difference between Western and non-Western concepts and identities are problematic in themselves. The long history of interaction between different cultures suggests that though the specificities of history and culture are important, we should also be mindful that contemporary identity politics is played out in zones of interaction that are characterized, shaped by ideas and behaviors from diverse sources and processes, including globalization. Hence, as one anthropologist has pointed out, rather than trying to rescue an image of a purely indigenous sexuality, distinct and untainted by outside Western influence, it is more useful to ask what kinds of interactions, connections, and conflicts emerge in the porous zones. 3. 4 Histories of sexuality In order to think about the social field within which sexual cultures are embedded, it is important to historicize sexuality. For ideas about sexuality, as about its relationship to gender, have developed through time in conjunction with a number of other factors. Within this context, we must also think of how sexual cultures are located within fields of power. In all cultures, including the European, a wide variety of conceptions of gender and sexuality existed before the advent of the modern era. Many forms of expression, body appearance, gestures, voice, and so on were seen to be part of male and female, and a broad range of sexual behaviors were tolerated. Some theorists now argue for a strong connection between modernity and the emergence of norms around gender identities and sexual behavior. This concerned the consolidation of hierarchies such that certain kinds of gender identities and specific forms of sexualities were seen to be superior to others. So, for example, masculine men and heterosexuality became the standards for normality. Looking at some examples, let us keep in mind the link between gender and sexuality. Historical analysis tells us that the two are mutually reinforcing concepts and each helps define the other. In this section, we will explore three other contexts, those that have particular relevance for non-Western societies. The colonial era was particularly important as a context that allows us to understand the social and political nature of sexuality. Indeed, the sexual politics of colonialism was one of the most significant strands in discourses that justified colonial rule, provided indices of difference between Europeans and non-Europeans, as well as lay at the basis of European anxieties about colonialism. A significant justification for colonial rule lay in the frequently reiterated notion of reform that was required within colonized societies. Native sexual mores were frequently regarded as key objects of such reform and were also held up proof of the moral inferiority of colonized populations. So, colonized societies were seen to be characterized by passionate unreason and unruliness. Levine 2006, 125, with regard to sexual behavior, and it was a common belief that native religious and other beliefs justified loose sexual mores. This lack of reason in the sexual arena mirrored colonial incapacity for self-rule. Levine 2006, 125. Further, while on the one hand a significant colonial fear centered around the threat to the white woman resident in the colonies from the uncontrollably lascivious black man, Inglis's discussion for Papua New Guinea, Inglis 1978, non-Western women were frequently characterized as sexually permissive, Alula 1986. Many of these stereotypes remain with us to this day. There were both differences and similarities between the sexual cultures of the colonial masters and their colonized subjects around the world. And yet, the similarities tended to be largely denied. Why was this? For example, there was widespread prevalence of homoeroticism among European populations in the colonies, and, for many European men in particular, the relative lack of proscription against homoeroticism was a key attraction for traveling and working in the colonies. Aldrich, 2003, Chaudhuri, 2004. It could be suggested that the sameness of some of the sexual practices of the rulers and the ruled was a key threat to claims of moral and cultural superiority by colonial powers. Hence, the assertion of sexual difference became an important part of the discourse of European superiority. The production of colonial discourses around sexual and gender identities was significantly focused on one aspect, that the gender and sexual identities of the colonized were different from those of the colonizing populations. It is these contexts that need to be kept in mind when we consider the reasons for the promulgation of colonial laws that sought to normalize sexual behavior in the colonies. As is well known, Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code, drafted in 1860 and passed soon after, proscribes carnal intercourse against the order of nature. The fact that same-sex behavior among consenting adults was only decriminalized in India in 2009 also tells us about the overlap between the sexual politics of colonial and post-colonial eras. 3.5 Sexuality, identity, power. There are different ways in which the field of sexuality acts as a significant site of identity, whether this relates to gender, community, or nation. Let us consider some contexts. Sexual identities are simultaneously historical and contingent. That is to say, they have an unstable nature that is influenced by social and cultural circumstances. Further, there is no necessary link between sexual practice and sexual identity. So, in many non-Western countries, non-heterosexual behavior does not necessarily lead to an assumption of being of a gay identity. However, while we may say that sexual identities are fictions, i.e., invented and fluid, they can also serve the very real role of acting as points of resistance and support. This is most obviously true in the case of, say, homosexuality. In the West, for example, the construction of a gay community has been central to responses to HIV and AIDS. Similarly, the emergence of gay groups in non-Western countries has served to intervene in and guide, among other things, debates around compulsory heterosexuality. Additionally, such groups have also intervened in debates about other kinds of norms formulated by the post-colonial nation-states. These include those that have to do with ideas of authentic Indian, African, etc., cultures that are now being destroyed by westernization. Writers and activists linked to gay, lesbian, and queer movements in non-Western countries have played an important role in rethinking notions of the ideal family and normative gender identities. There is a persistent debate among scholars and activists in many non-Western countries regarding lesbian, gay, and queer identities that center around the idea that these are Western identities and not really relevant in the context of non-heterosexual behavior in non-Western countries. This is a significant discussion for at least three reasons. That cultural differences are important to consider. 2. That non-heterosexual behavior has also been a normal aspect of, say, Indian culture. 3. Sexual identities are also class identities, inasmuch gay and lesbian in India might be terms that circulate in relatively privileged contexts. Notwithstanding this, many would argue that gay, lesbian, and queer identities are significant aspects of contemporary sexual politics within non-Western countries and should be given the same attention as indigenous categories. After all, we don't refuse to travel in trains or use electricity because they originated from the West. Gender and sexuality are not merely ways of describing specific social relations. They are also sites of contestation and transformation of collective and personal identities. Hence, simultaneously as gender and sexual norms in a particular society seek to produce ideas about what our culture is, they also give rise to counter-discourses and movements of resistance to these norms. The contestation of established norms is itself a struggle for recognition. It asks that actually existing state of affairs be recognized for what they are actually existing rather than be treated as non-existent through defining norms that wish it away. So, women's desires, gender oppression, and non-heteronormative behavior are realities of human existence and cannot simply be swept away by ideas of feminine purity, the natural superiority of men, and the naturalization of heterosexuality. The transsexual and transgender histories of different societies around the world point to a multitude of sexual and gender identities and behaviors. The Hijdas of India, Nanda 1990. Reddy 2005. The Kathoey of Thailand, Jackson 1997, and the Varya, Bolstorff 2008, of Indonesia are only three of several such long-established identities. Many writers on transgender issues, Richard M. Juang notes, have referred to cultural systems in which third gender or sexes have an established role in order to develop a critique of the fixity and universality of contemporary Western taxonomies of gender and sex, Juang, 2006, p. 256. And that the existence of other cultural taxonomies is part of a larger body of evidence supporting the claim that Western models of sex, gender, and sexuality do not reflect some bedrock cultural necessity but one of several roads of historical development that are open to future change, Juang, 2006, p. 256. Given these alternative sexual histories, the situation of post-colonial modernity, where such realities are sought to be suppressed and incorporated into a monolithic nationalist myth of heteronormativity, is a striking one. The history of colonial and post-colonial modernity in our region is, in fact, one of suppression and marginalization of gender and sexual identities that did not, or do not, live up to heterosexual ideals that were produced through a collaboration between colonial discourse and a native elite that aspired to emulate norms defined by the colonizing powers. So, both Hijras and Kathoey, the former may be transvestites or transsexuals and the latter is the Thai term for a biological hermaphrodite, face considerable discrimination in their societies. This is, despite the fact that within Hinduism Hijras have enjoyed well-defined ritual and religious roles, and within Thai culture, Kathoeys have historically occupied a traditionally recognized third gender category. As suggested above, the colonial period was a significant watershed in the making of modern cultures of sexualities in post-colonial societies. So, certain acts and behaviors were criminalized and others were put forward as normative. Notwithstanding the adoption of colonial legal and moral attitudes towards sexuality in most post-colonial societies, there is a great deal of historical as well as contemporary evidence that points to the existence of well-established contexts of homoeroticism in the countries of the region. So, in performative traditions in India such as the Marathi, Parsi, and Gujarati theatres, men who acted as women were preferred to women actors, Hanse 2004. And in contemporary Afghanistan, the tradition, known as bachabazi of older married men keeping young male companions is a common one, Yaqub Ibrahimi, 2008, p. 8. That in the latter case, it has also become a context of sexual exploitation does not itself undermine the idea of homoeroticism in the region. The important issue here is the existence of parallel strands of homoeroticism and homophobia, the parallel existence of men who have sex with men but also hate men, who might be identified or self-identify as homosexual calls for an explanation. Why is it, for example, that Iranian law permits sex change operations but that homosexuality is punishable by death? There are at least two distinct but related contexts that need to be engaged with. The first relates to the difference between behavior and identity, and the second to notions of masculine identity. The term gay is part of the identity politics of homosexuality that pertains both to self-identification as well as an assertion of the right to openly adopt certain lifestyle characteristics. Now, as considerable research shows, there is no dearth of men in different parts of the world who have homoerotic relations but do not identify as either gay or homosexual. The latter aspect relates both to the notion that homoeroticism is an unexceptional part of men's lives, as well as the idea that homosexual men are effeminate or woman-like. Hence, while a large number of men have relationships with other men, there is stigma to being the woman, i.e., being penetrated in the relationship. Different terminologies, kotis and panthis, in India, for example, express this anxiety. Hence, simultaneously as homosexuality is considered a life cycle activity or a harmless pastime, it is also situated in a context where it does not disturb traditional notions of masculine identity and responsibility to get married, be the provider, extend the lineage, etc. Though it is a different situation in Papua New Guinea, PNG, Gilbert Hurt, 1999, points out that, while it is true that Zambia practice homoerotic insemination, they lack the category homosexual and have no homosexuals to fill the category even if they did. Hurt, 1999, p. 17. That is to say, while non-heteronormative behavior is very much a part of PNG culture, the manner in which it is conceptualized may be quite different from that in the West. The term men who have sex with men was introduced into the HIV/AIDS prevention lexicon in the late 1980s in order to account for a group that was considered at risk but could not be accounted for through an identity-related term such as gay. If the cultural, politics and debate, Cohen, 2005, around terms such as this and others that have gained prominence through NGO activism remind us that classifications have a complex social history and are not naturally produced. They also, importantly, point to the possibilities of change through research, agitation, and activism. There is an additional complication to the above that has to do with the debate on the imposition of Western and universalizing categories on non-Western societies. Many scholars and activists now suggest that we ought to simultaneously recognize the long history of non-heteronormative behavior in the Asia-Pacific, as well as resist the temptation to simply label these under the rubrics of gay and queer. The latter context, it is suggested, ignores the manner in which a particular penetrative Western discourse has interlaced sexuality, gay rights, human right, Oriental convictions, and social Darwinism in confronting the question of same-sex desire and practice in the non-Western world. Server, 2008, p. 15. Moving on to other contexts of identity, one of the ways in which sexuality, gender and community identity come together can be explored through the notion of honor killings that are prevalent in India and Pakistan in particular. Honor killings occur for different reasons, however, the most frequent reason concerns perceived transgressions of familial and community boundaries when an offending couple decides to marry on its own accord. It is noticeable that there are more women victims of honor killings than men. The most significant aspect of honor concerns the control of women's sexuality by men that is seen to have suffered a slight when a woman makes her own decision regarding a marital bond. Courts do punish the perpetrators of such crimes, however, they frequently reflect society-wide attitudes to masculine ideas regarding female sexuality. So, for example, in many cases, the patriarchal bias, Vorich, 2005, embodied in the application of laws, has meant that, instead of systematically intervening to address the violations of the right to life, judges have focused on the victim's conduct and have been influenced by and reflected customary attitudes condoning the control of and violence against women. Even in the most progressive judgments to date, when dealing with honor killings, the courts have continued to focus on the issue of provocation, Vorich, 2005, p. 104. Judges, as Patricia Uberoi points out, bring to their interpretation of the law very masculinist sex role stereotypes while manifestly upholding the cause of women. Uberoi, 1995, p. 321. Female sexuality and the discourse of public women come together in another way. An example from contemporary Kerala will be helpful. During the 1990s, as several scholars have pointed out, there have increasingly strident Debate that index augmented public fears about sexual transgression by women, Devika, 2009, p. 33. Hence, visions of dystopia in public discussion in Kerala in the 1990s is painted heavily with the horrors of Sexuality Unleashed, Devika, 2009, p. 33. Significantly, young women who had been subject to sexual crimes were often portrayed not as victims, but those whose worldliness was to blame for the crimes they suffered. So, a High Court judgment on the so-called Vithura case of 2000 involving the serial rape of a teenage girl noted that she was a lascivious strumpet who, as the days passed by, became more and more coquettish and voluptuous by availing the services of beauty parlors. Sri Kumar, 2001, quoted in Devika, 2009, p. 33. As J. Devika points out, the fixation with the sexualization of female bodies is telling of how misogyny forms a sizable part of elitist cultural panic. 2009, p. 34. Women in public spaces not conforming to masculine rules of modesty are frequently the source of a great deal of masculine and patriarchal anxiety regarding the decline of society. The decline perspective appears to have particularly salient in an era of globalization, where women are seen to be affected by the cultural and social changes in a manner not befitting models of feminine honor and respectability. Similarly, female genital mutilation, FGM, which is still under practice among various African communities, the Bohra Muslim sect, and in Middle East as part of rituals with a view to essentially prevent homosexuality and subversion of female sexual desire. This practice firmly denies women's right to sexual choice and prevents young women from marrying outside their community at cost of inflicting bodily violence. Diary, Varis. Sexual violence is another significant context of identity politics. Rape, it has been recognized, is more than a physical act. It is also a means of perpetuating symbolic violence that seeks to establish the superiority of masculine identity. Further, in cases of rape in situations of war and other conflict, the act also seeks to assert that the superiority of the rapist's group over that of the group to which the raped women belong. This relates to the idea that if men are not able to protect the honor of their women, then it is their own honor that has been slighted. Increasingly, feminist thinkers have argued that the manner in which we think about rape as lost honor, for example, is itself problematic, as it significantly draws upon male notions of honor. Nivedita Menon suggests that simultaneously as we seek to prevent and punish crimes of honor and treat these as a human rights issue, we must also seek to problematize the notion that rape is the worst thing that can happen to a woman. According to Menon, we must question the meaning of rape itself. Menon, 2004, p. 156. Original emphasis. For, she says, rape as violation is not only a feminist understanding, it is perfectly compatible with patriarchal and sexist notions of women's bodies and our sexuality. Menon, 2004, p. 159. Finally, while the above discussion may have more frequently referred to female sexuality, the manner in which it is conceptualized stands in a direct relationship to the ways in which male sexuality is imagined. So, for example, good and bad women in Indian cinema have, though such representations are changing, historically been represented as the self-sacrificing wife and sexless mother on the one hand, and the promiscuous vamp on the other. The man who has multiple partners is, on the hand, frequently represented as virile and someone who embodies genuine masculinity. In these ways, the cultures of sexuality illuminate a number of contexts, human interactions that, in turn, tell us something about the ways in which cultures of sociality and power unfold. 3.6 Summary. The topic of sexualities is frequently approached either through a biological lens or through one that assumes a fixed cultural template. So, for the Indian case, it is common to suggest a direct link between contemporary Indian sexual cultures and classical Indian love texts such as Vatsyayana's Kama Sutra and Kalyan Malla's Ananga Ranga. Any such link is highly tenuous. Contemporary sexual cultures are formed in the crucible of a variety of nationalist politics and transnational flows. Assertions of non-heterosexual identities, global sexual health programs, the effects of new consumer cultures, changing patterns of work and leisure among young women, and the effects of different media flows. Further, it is also inadequate to assume that ideas around sexuality in non-Western countries has been as stable as is sometimes posited in, say, NGO or anthropological narratives that seek to account for local practices in global sexual health campaigns. It may, in fact, be quite impossible to find a purely indigenous sexuality that can be contrasted with a Western one. Both have been formed through interaction with each other. Western and non-Western may not capture that history. Where European sexuality has been made through the image of the non-European primitive, or where the post-colonial nation-state has built upon this discourse in order to produce its own authentic culture. The substantial portion of sexual cultures in the non-Western world is made out of these sorts of hybrid transactions. Finally, the search for an authentic Indian or traditional sexual culture is worth thinking about for another reason. What anxieties does it express? And what kinds of positions of power does it embody? Thank you for watching. We will see you in the next video with next chapter.